Thanks for joining me. This lab session is entitled Recording Project Scripts. I used the web test plan template and then recorded each function. I also assigned each recorded function a name different from the default thread group name. Then I inserted transaction and simple controllers as needed. Assertions were inserted to verify page navigation. My objective is to have script scenarios that can run separately or together, depending on what I'll need to do in the future until the project is complete. I started out with recording single function scripts like you see in the display. Then I began to bring them together into a single JMeter script called Web Tours Performance. From there, the scripts can be executed individually or in sequence or in parallel mode. I did not stop at that. I calculated current and next day dates for departure and return dates. They should replace the data in the flight create processes. The flight cancellation functions are randomized by using the interleave controller to select cancel checked and cancel all options as alternative processes. For the flight change function, it is defined to navigate back to the first find flight page and change the arrival city, click continue, and then change the outbound flight time. Click continue until the invoice page is reached and then click log off. In the interest of time, let me post a shorter lab plan. I have already identified and developed a set of scripts needed for this Web Tours project. Most of the modifications required have been accomplished too. We will make a few more changes so you can see how to modify a script in JMeter. The approach of the plan will introduce you to the application functions, the JMeter scripts involved, how they were formed, what JMeter elements are used and how they work, and finally, how the test scripts work individually. This approach will expose you to much of the JMeter functionality and features. Here is the lecture and lab plan for the Web Tours Performance Test Project using JMeter. The first thing is to get familiar with the target application under test, that is Web Tours, and step through the major script components as an overview exercise, according to the list you see here, and describe how some components were added or modified, and then demonstrate toggling functions, demonstrate single function tests and outputs by stepping through each test script, and finally demonstrate how initial scripts are recorded and inserted into a target script. The Web Tours application installs locally on your machine. It comes with a start process, and then it can be launched from your browser. Let's walk through this and the application to gain familiarity. I installed Web Tours on my C drive, and you can see the main folder right here, Web Tours. I'm going to double click on it and open it. And down at the bottom there is a file, startserver.bat. That is the file that actually starts the server for the Web Tours application. So I double click on that and you see a little pop-up command prompt. Excuse me. And here it is. And you can see Web Tours. I'm going to minimize that. That's all we need. We need that server to start. It started successfully. And now, before I go to the application, I want to show you one more folder, the CGI-bin. If I double click on that and then double click on users, this is where I mentioned earlier about all the user IDs that I had created. Most of them I created with a few exceptions, but these are intended to be utilized in the performance testing exercises. We'll talk about that some more a little later. Go back to Web Tours. As I said, we started the server, so now we're ready to actually run the application in the browser. So I go to the browser, open it, and I can, at this point, because I've used it a few times, I can just type in local, start there, and there's the actual address. Localhost 1080 is the port, and Web Tours is the application name, and press the enter key, and now we have Web Tours launched. Here we are at the login page. We can use user credentials to log in, but there are two other pages that can be accessed without logging in. So I want to show you those two. First, the sign up. This is where we actually create user ID. So at the register page, we can do this. We can provide detailed information for username, password, and so on, and then the application will create that user ID in that location I showed you just a moment ago. If we have a user ID, we can access the rest of the application with that, and I'll show you in a minute. I want to scroll down and actually just go back, page back, and show you the administration page. That one is utilized for some performance settings to impact the application and see the results within the performance test results. We're going to go back. I'm not going into detail right now with that. And here is, I'm going to enter one of my IDs with the password. And now log in. When we're logged in, we actually see in the login area a set of buttons. One for flights, excuse me, itinerary, home, and sign off. If we sign off, we go back to the login page. Type in user credentials again. And now we're back to the main menu, if you will. And from this point, as I said, we have flights, itinerary, and home. Home is actually this page. This is the home page where you can see the user ID that's logged in and some other information. Let's click on the flights. When we do that, we go to the first page where we can find a particular flight, departure and arrival information, date and departure and return date, passengers, round trip or not, seating preferences, as well as types of seating, whether it's first class, business, or coach. And then you move on to the rest of the information regarding a flight. If I click on the itinerary, if a person has one or more flights already scheduled or had been scheduled, this one is an old flight back for Los Angeles to Denver back in 2019. So this was old. It could either be canceled or everything. If there were multiple flight schedules, itinerary, then you can cancel all without clicking the check button. But if you click the check button, this is the button you would use to cancel that particular flight. or flights. And home, as I said, takes us back to the main menu, if you will. And then, of course, sign off takes you back to the login page. So that's a rough way to get familiar with the application. We didn't go into total detail about creating a flight. Let's do that. And password. And log in. And now we're going to go back to the flights page, and we can specify an arrival place we want to go to. So we're saying we're departing from Denver, arriving in London. It by default will specify whatever the current date is, and then the return date is automatically the next day. But you can change that to whatever. Number of passengers is set to 1. It's set for a single direction, and with this box check we have a round trip ticket instead of a one-way ticket. And it's set for no seating preference. If we wanted an aisle seat, we could specify that. If we want first class, we could specify that. And then continue on to the next page. And in the next page, we are telling the application what time of the day we're looking to fly. And it gives you up to 4 times of the day. If it's just one way, you would just see one set. If it's both ways, then you're going to see the return as well. And so we're saying by default 8 a.m. we're going out, we're flying out, and at 8 a.m. the next day we're going to return. We can leave that for now. So the total is 635 plus 635, and that comes out to 1270. So that's the total for that ticket. And this is a credit card number. It's just a bogus number. It accepts that number. And we have a first name and last name. We can put something in that, and we can then enter information for address. And finally, we can then continue on. And now we're actually at the invoice page. We see the details for the invoice. We see that the flight in and out and what day, and that it's a first class ticket, and that it's being charged to this credit card. And the balance is now showing 0 because this is what was applied to the card. And we can then book another, or we can sign off, or we can go and look at the itinerary. If we click on the itinerary, then we now see a second ticket that is being shown, and this one is the most recent. It's the second one here, and we see all the detailed information. Now, if we wanted, we could cancel all, or we can just check one of these and cancel it. I'm not going to do that right now, but those are things, the functions that we're going to be testing. So we're going to sign off, and now we're back to the beginning, and that should be enough to consider ourselves familiar with the flow of the application. We are now ready to walk through the script's major components as an overview exercise. Okay, Project Web Tours is underway, and we have been given marching orders, so to speak. Let me drag this diagram for you to see, look at again. I showed it to you earlier in one of the course lectures, and there's a couple of pieces of information that I'm wanting to make sure that you keep in mind as we go forward. we have several functions within the application that we want to make use of during the performance testing project. And they're listed here, starting with log in, log out, all the way down to flight change. I've even given labels, 3-character names to these functions, but they also use as prefixes to the user IDs. So we've identified, as part of the workload model, how many users we're going to use for each function. And so the names of those users will start with this prefix, whatever label I have for that function, and there'll be a number, 1 through whatever the maximum number of users are that are designated here. So log 1 through 22 will be the user IDs that will perform the log in, log off functions. They'll just get on, log in, and then log out. The reg 1 through 5 will do registry functions, while the fin 1 through 23 will do flight inquiry function, and so on. All of them we have designated so many users that are going to do a particular function, and they'll all be mixed together and create this percentage of load during our tests. Now let's take a look at the test environment for the Web Tours project. Let me open up the folder area first. Go to the JMeter scripts, and I have a Web Tours folder specifically for the scripts that we are using for this project. Now, I started out with several of them, as you can see, and the main one, the main script, if you will, is the Web Tours performance.jmx file. That one contains all of the scripts we need. I have decided that it would be in our best interest, in both our best interest, to make sure that I go ahead and create all the scripts and then spend time showing you what I did, but try to keep it more at a high level. Otherwise, it could be hours of time that we'd have to spend sharing all of the detail, and that might not be in your best interest. Hopefully you'll want to spend some time on it on your own and get more familiar with it by breaking it down and taking it a piece at a time. But for now, let's take a look at this particular script, and then I'm going to come out and look at a couple of other scripts to show you that process of merging. See how that works, to make sure you're comfortable with that idea, with that concept. All right, for now, let's open the main script, and you can see it's fairly large. Here are all of the threads. I've named them to make sure that you know exactly what they are. So log in, log out is the script for logging in and logging out, and register, flight pay, flight change, flight inquiry, and there are two others. I'm not going to go to that one just now. Itinerary and itinerary suite C. One is for looking at the itinerary, and the second one is for cancellation process in the itinerary function. Now, go back to these other two. Flight pay utility for fit and flight pay utility for FCA. So if you remember, we're using the flight pay function, or in this case, we're using it as a utility to work with creating more flights for the FIN, for inquiry, to be able to make sure we have enough flights out there to do inquiry functionality, as well as to do flight cancellation functionality. So that's the reason for those two additional thread groups that exist there that may or may not be used in a test run. Before we drill down to the individual scripts that are shown here, let's talk a little bit more about the main script and how that's constructed. First of all, it has a number of events at the beginning of that script that are from the, if I go to this test plan statement and go use the add, there's a group of configuration elements. So these are elements that you see here that have to do with managing header, cookies, cache, and other requests. And so along with that are listeners. And the listeners you see at the bottom on the left side of the screen, which has to do with various reporting that are data collection or performance data collection that we're trying to look at as a result of running any given test. So the main script has information that would normally be in each individual script. But when you merge the individual scripts into the main script, there's no need for duplication. Sometimes you may have a need to, say, duplicate the view results tree or some other listener that you would like at the individual script level. But in most cases, when you create a main script, you will make use of the configuration elements and listeners to envelop the individual scripts. So that's what you see here, is that in the beginning, we have, starting here, all the way down to here, all of this information, or these events, or elements, or one-time use, as well as the reporting, or listeners. They're also one-time use, and they're enveloping the individual scripts. Okay, now, one other question I want to answer is, how do you actually build a main script from individual scripts? Let's take a look at that. I'm going to close this out for the moment just by doing a restart. I have nothing that I want to save. Now, let's pull in an individual script that we have out there in that library or in that folder under JMeter. Whoops. JMeter scripts web tools. Now, let's pull in the flight pay. There. So now you see those configuration elements at the beginning, and then the thread for flight pay, and within it, login and the payment process. So if we wanted to add another script to this script and let this one become the main script, if you will, then what we do is we come here, well, we can do it here from here, and say we want to merge. And now we're still pointing to the web tours, so we'll pull in some other one. Let's say we didn't have login and we wanted to bring that in. We click open, and what happens is you see, starting from right after the flight pay thread, and I can expand this one, and we still see the login and pay, but after that, everything else here came from the other script, the login script. So you see there's duplication of information, and that's where you'd start, is to remove those. Maybe the user-defined variables. Let's see if we have something different. If that's already defined, it is, then we don't need that one. So we could easily get rid of all of this information here because it's really duplication. And then now we have the meat of the login process down here. So we can take that as is, and even the recorder, but we don't want to duplicate that. If that was in the other script, then one of them should go. Now, one other thing I'd like to point out, I think this is an opportunity to do that, is if you notice in the login script, there is something called test fragment. And that you'll see when we go back to the main script, we're going to find out that that exists. And that's another element that is used to load pieces of code that becomes reusable within the rest of the script, so that code can be utilized from calls. And we'll see how that works. So that this is a way to make use of code multiple times without actually coding it multiple times. So if there's any potential duplication of coding within the individual scripts from the main script, then the main script can have this single set of code that can be called throughout the rest of the individual scripts that are inside the main script. Hopefully you followed that idea. So, in the test fragment, if I expand it, what we have is something called login process and logoff process. So the idea is that, in most of these individual scripts, we would be logging in with a user and doing the function and then logging off. So this is a way to take the login and log off process and put it into this test fragment area. And now we can call that with some other elements to reuse it as many times as we need. We'll look at that a little closer back in the main script. I just want to point it out to you at this moment, get you starting to think about that. And let's see if there was something else I wanted to mention. So, just a reminder, I go back here to log in, or I go to the end, basically. That's where I want to merge something. And I right click and use the merge function. And that allows me to bring in another script, and I can do this multiple times and pull in various scripts into a single script. And that main script then can have configuration elements and listeners to encompass the individual scripts. And then in the individual scripts, there are maybe duplication of code that can be moved into the test fragment area and then called upon as many times as needed. Let's wrap up this part of the lab session with talking more about stepping through the components and describing components. This lab should be considered as part 1. We will conclude the lab in part 2, which follows. Let's take a closer look at the main script. Let's launch it from here. We want to focus a little bit more on some of the components, both what we've talked about and what we have not talked about. So, we have talked about the enveloping of the individual scripts. Let's start with the last statement here, mention about JSR R23 events. And this is part of, if we go up to the add process, there are preprocessors and post-processors. Both of them have a JSR 223 either as a post-processor or as a preprocessor. And those items, let's look at that a little closer. They are used in both running before an event or running after an event. And it actually is a way to insert coding. And the coding can use one of several languages. But the most common one is to use the, let me show you here more clearly. Scroll back up here. Is to use this Groovy scripting engine. In this particular case, I use the Java scripting. And so in the code, of course, it has to be the Java language, and you have to conform to the syntax for Java. But, as I said, this could have been written in the most common used language for these scripts, or Groovy, the language called Groovy, 2.41 at this point. So, in another place, you'll see me use Groovy, but you can use some of the others if you have knowledge of how to use them. JavaScript is available. And in the code, this particular one, it's about dates. So what I wanted to do was to, let me scroll down here so you can see this, or better yet, go to a full screen. There we go. And you can see the code that's available. And what we're doing, this is not a teach you the coding languages, but this one is particularly designed to provide, let me get to the right place here, yeah, there we go, to the end. The last statement, the log.info, and you'll see it in more than one place, those are designed to send the output to the log file, so we could see that that information is being created correctly, successfully. And so what we were looking to do is to create what I call formatted date 1 and formatted date 2. And we started with the current date. And so what we're looking to do is to create a format for the current date and one for the date plus 1. And you should see that right here where we adding 1 to the date. So for the DF1 format date, we actually came up in there. Over here, you may not be able to see it as clearly. There, I'm highlighting it. It's in month, day, year format with the slashes in between. And so we created that date for the current date, and then we added 1 to the date, and we're creating a second variable with the current date plus 1. So those will be utilized when we're creating a new flight schedule. Okay, now let me go back one more. Let's look at test fragment a little bit more. We talked about it, and in this case, what I did was I created 3 parts to the login process and then log off. And the reason being is the log, I believe it's the login B section where the login ID and user ID, yes, here we go. And so we have both a uSession and password and username. So those are being populated for this process. Now, when we look at the login B process, let's go with the login logout process. And in the login logout process, we have this TC login. It's a controller, transaction controller, and we have this thing called module controller. And here it is again. And then the login B process is actually physically located in each one of the test scripts or individual scripts. So what happens in the module controller, this is another event, another controller that's available to be able to select what do I want to run. Right now it says, could not find module, web tours register, test fragment, login a process. Well, in the test fragment, see, I can also pull code from other scripts within this test script, but I can expand on test fragment, and now I see those same processes that were defined up here. So this came from the original login script that I recorded, and now I'm able to select from that what do I want to process underneath this module controller. So I'm saying that the login will start with login A. So now that's selected. Notice the error message went away. Sometimes that gets refreshed, and we have to then go back in and reselect that. Okay, then, and I also wanted to do this to show you how this is done. Let's go to the login B process and expand that. And as I said, we've got the hard-coded values here, but let's look at the one for the login IDs. I believe that's here. Yeah. You'll notice that it's showing 2 variables put together. So we're saying user log prefix, which is going to be LOG, and then $log user, which is going to be the number. So put together, they create the name for a user ID. And in this case, it will start with log 1 and go on and increment from there. Well, how does it increment from there? Before I go there, I know you have that question. Let me make sure the login C is set. So it's another module controller. I expand the test fragment and I select login C. So now this script is ready. When it runs, it will pull code from two different places in the test fragment section. One is login A and the other is login C. Of course, there's log off. Is that there? Yes, it is. Further down, we see module controller, and we can click on that to select log off process. Now we have 3 of those processes in use in one of the individual scripts. All right, now let's back up, and we've got something else inside this thread group, a counter. We're using another element. If I go up here, add, config, element, and there is counter. So in counter, we have a few parameters. The first thing is to identify a variable name. Now remember, when we try to use it, we put in dollar, squiggly bracket, counter, squiggly bracket. But here, when we define it, we just give it the name. The next thing is we can put some comment, username value. We can give it a starting value, a number, and an increment value. So every time we loop through, the item is incremented by 1. So then, I'm sorry, I said something to you that was wrong. The top is just a name that we're giving, and we're calling it a counter. We could call it anything. But the variable name is here, log user. And if you remember, you saw that down here, log user. And see, we're referencing it, so dollar squiggly log user squiggly. So here we are. We've specified that we ought to create with this counter element. We want to create a variable name, log user, and we want to start it with the value 1. Each time we come through or loop through this process, it's going to be incremented by 1. We could set a maximum value and a different format. Those we're not interested in. It's simple. We just want a number and to be able to capture that number like a text field. Okay. Now, another thing. Let's go collapse this and look at this thread group. So this one is called login, log off. This one we're referring to as a individual script. This process of logging in and logging out is going to be controlled by this thread group. We're using one of the JP at GC plugins called Ultimate Thread Group. It's not the normal thread group, but it's similar. It starts with the same information about the action to be taken after a sampler error, but inside the scheduler we have where we can start thread counts, we can create an initial delay of so many seconds and startup time in so many seconds and hold for so many seconds. as well as shut down within so many seconds. So this one is a good word for it, to call it ultimate thread group, because you can break down the process so that we even have a graph to show how this particular thread group works. So you can see it's not going to start up until so many seconds within the process. And then it's going to start stepping and adding users in this fashion until we reach another certain time point, and then it's going to hold that X number of users until we're almost to the last 10 seconds of the run, and then it's going to shut them down gradually, but within 10 seconds. So that's what we're seeing in this particular thread group called Ultimate Thread Group. Now, in talking about thread groups, let's look at the rest of the individual scripts and what their thread groups look like. Here, we're using yet another round of Ultimate Thread Group, but in this case, it actually is different in how it ramps up, holds on, and ramps down. Then we have the flight pay, which is the normal thread group. But notice the loop count, those things correlate to what we saw in the chart. And let's go to the flight change. We've got 10. We've got flight inquiry. We've got 16 of those users. But it's loops. Because of the loop, we're going to increment the number of the user ID for that particular thread group. And itinerary, 16, C, 8. So these correlate to what we saw for the workload processing. How many users should run for each of these threads. And these threads normally defined this way, if they're all enabled, then those will run in a parallel fashion. So they're not going to wait on each other. They're going to attempt to start based on what's defined for that thread group. Now, if we wanted them to be in sequence, we go back to the test plan and we have a checkbox that says run thread groups consecutively, one at a time. So this can control how those thread groups run. By default, it's not checked, so therefore they would run in parallel if they're enabled. Right now, none of them are enabled. The only one that's enabled is the last one, itinerary C thread group. Now, it doesn't matter the fact that I ran that one by itself. It's okay. Anytime you want to run one of them by themselves, all the rest of them need to be disabled. And those can be toggled. And the toggling is here. So I can change it to be enabled, change it to be disabled. Enable, disable. So that's a way to do that. Otherwise, I can right click on it and just click on enable or disable. The toggle is the same. It just takes whatever it is currently, it sets it to the other option. Hopefully you understood that. Okay, so we now have, again, we've left all of these disabled. The only thing that would run, if I executed right now, would be the itinerary C thread. I believe that's all I want to cover at this point. Do join me on that next lab. We'll go into further detail about with all of these individual scripts. My time has ended for this session. I thank you for yours. Join me in the next video.